At 2 o'clock, the sunlight in the conservatory was exactly what I'd engineered it to be. Golden and sharp, cutting through the glass ceiling and illuminating the dust motes dancing above the white aisle runner. Everything was perfect. The ferns were lush, the orchids were in full bloom, and Cooper stood at the altar looking at me like I was the only person in the world who mattered. But my eyes kept drifting to the front row. The 6 chairs I'd reserved with silk ribbons sat empty. Not just empty, they were glaringly vacant, a gap in the perfection I'd spent 3 years building. My phone buzzed against my palm, hidden in the folds of my dress. I glanced down. A text from my mother, Erin. "Tucker needs us. It's the championship. It's just a garden party, we'll catch the next one." I stared at the screen. Just a garden party. Not my wedding. Not the launch of the biggest project of my career. Just a party. A second later, a notification popped up from Instagram. My brother Tucker had posted a selfie from the locker room, grinning with his helmet under one arm. The caption read, "Real family shows up for the real wins." I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I felt something click into place inside my chest, cold and final. I looked at the empty chairs, then at my maid of honor. I handed her my phone. "Take down the reserved signs," I said, my voice steady. "Fill those seats with friends. And start the live stream. Now. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community." As the string quartet began to play, a soft melody echoing against the glass walls, I walked toward Cooper. But my mind wasn't on the music. It was rewinding, dissecting the anatomy of this betrayal. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a miscommunication. This was the culmination of 27 years of being a ghost in my own family's house. Since I was 5 years old, I'd been background noise to the Tucker Show. My brother was the sun, burning bright and loud, demanding every ounce of gravity in our orbit. I was the landscape architect even back then, quietly arranging the scenery so he could shine. When I won the state design competition in high school, my parents missed the ceremony because Tucker had a scrimmage. Not even a game, just a practice match. When I graduated college with honors, they left early because Tucker needed a ride to training camp. They called me low maintenance. They called me independent. They praised me for not needing them, never realizing that I didn't need them because I'd learned that needing them was a guarantee of starvation. It's a survival mechanism, really. Psychologists call it invisible child syndrome. You learn early that your needs are an inconvenience, a burden on a family system already strained by the demands of the golden child. So you shrink. You make yourself small. You become self-sufficient not out of strength, but out of necessity. You stop asking for water because you know the well runs dry for you. But this was different. I hadn't been vague about today. I'd sent formal invitations on heavy cardstock 3 months ago. I'd followed up with emails. I'd called my mother 2 weeks ago to confirm the timeline. They knew this was my wedding. They knew this was the unveiling of the conservatory I designed and built with my own hands. But to them, it wasn't a milestone. It was optional. A garden party they could skip because Tucker, their 23-year-old man-child, needed a cheering section for a game he played every weekend. And then there was the money. $65,000. That was the trust fund my grandmother had left me. It was supposed to be for my education, for my business. But 3 years ago my father, Benjamin, sat me down with a serious expression. "We need to make an investment in the family's future," he'd said. "Tucker needs a condo near the training facility. Safer. It keeps him focused." They didn't ask me. They told me. They drained my account to buy a luxury apartment for a guy who'd already totaled 2 cars and had a DUI record they'd paid to seal. They called it an investment. Called it theft. But I let it happen because I was still the invisible child, terrified that if I spoke up, I'd lose the tiny scraps of affection they still tossed my way. Not anymore. As I reached the altar and took Cooper's hands, I realized I wasn't just getting married. I was resigning from my role. I was done being the ghost. Today I was the architect. And I was about to burn the old blueprints to the ground. The ceremony wasn't sad. It was defiant. Every word the officiant spoke felt like a declaration of independence. When Cooper slid the ring onto my finger, I looked out at the crowd. The front row was filled with my college roommates, my business partners, the people who'd actually helped me build this life. They were beaming. They were present. And then there was Grandpa Robert. He sat in the second row, leaning on his cane, wearing a suit that looked older than me but pressed to perfection. He was the only one with my blood in his veins who'd bothered to show up. He'd driven 2 hours by himself because my parents had told him they were too busy with Tucker to pick him up. After we kissed and the applause died down, Grandpa Robert waved me over. He didn't say a word about the empty seats beside him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box and an envelope. "Your grandmother wanted you to have this," he said, his voice raspy. Inside the box was a vintage watch, delicate and silver. It wasn't flashy. It was timeless. Inside the envelope was a check for $1,000. "I know it's not $65,000, he whispered, his eyes wet. "But it's clean money. It's given with love, Willow. Not leverage." I hugged him, burying my face in his shoulder that smelled like tobacco and peppermint. That $1,000 meant more to me than the millions my brother was chasing. It was an offering, not a transaction. Meanwhile, the live stream was running. My maid of honor had propped the phone on a tripod right by the altar. I checked the view count as we walked back down the aisle. 500 people. Then 800. Then 2,000. People in our small town were tuning in. They saw the stunning conservatory, the golden light, the joy on my face. And they saw the empty front row. The comments were already rolling in. "Where are her parents? Is that her grandpa all alone? Wait, isn't her brother playing right now?" I looked at the camera and smiled. I wasn't hiding the emptiness anymore. I was highlighting it. I wanted everyone to see exactly what my family had chosen to miss. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a rebellion. I was taking the narrative back. For 27 years they'd controlled the story. Tucker the hero, Willow the extra. Today the camera was on me. And the silence from their seats was screaming louder than any cheer in that stadium. 50 miles away at State Stadium, the roar of the crowd was deafening, but my parents weren't listening to the cheers. It was halftime. Tucker was in the locker room, probably checking his hair in the mirror, hyping himself up for the second half. In the VIP box, seats they'd paid $500 for, my mother, Erin, and my father, Benjamin, finally pulled out their phones. They weren't looking for news about me. They were looking for the praise they felt entitled to. They wanted to see photos of Tucker's first quarter touchdown. They wanted the dopamine hit of likes and comments telling them they'd raised a star. Instead, they found a different kind of firestorm. My maid of honor's live stream had been shared by the local community page. It was trending in our town. The title, "The Wedding They Missed," sat right next to a thumbnail of the empty front row with their names on the reserved signs. The comments weren't celebrating Tucker. They were eviscerating my parents. "Wait, isn't that Erin and Ben at the game? They skipped their daughter's wedding for a regular season game. Who does that? That poor girl." I can only imagine the panic that set in. Not guilt. Panic. Narcissists don't feel guilt. They feel the loss of control. My mother didn't text me to apologize. She texted me to stop the bleeding. My phone lit up during the reception dinner. "You are humiliating your brother on his big day. Take it down now. You are selfish. Everyone is looking at us." I didn't answer. I just took a screenshot. Back at the stadium, the second half started. But something had shifted. Word had gotten to the locker room. Maybe a teammate showed him, maybe he checked his own mentions. Tucker ran onto the field, but his head wasn't in the game. He was looking up at the VIP box. He was glancing at his phone on the sidelines. He was distracted. And in a game of inches, distraction is dangerous. In the fourth quarter, Tucker missed a block he should have made in his sleep. A linebacker twice his size plowed through the line. I didn't see it happen live, but I heard about it later. The snap of bone. The silence that fell over the stadium. It wasn't a career-ending injury, not technically. But for a player whose entire value was built on being untouchable, on being the golden boy who never fell, it was the beginning of the end. He was carted off the field, not to applause, but to the quiet murmurs of a crowd that had just spent halftime reading about how he'd treated his sister. Everything stayed silent for a week. I went on my honeymoon, a working vacation to the coast with Cooper, and I didn't answer a single call. When we returned, the voicemails were waiting. My parents had shifted tactics. They weren't angry anymore. They were gaslighting. It was a miscommunication, my mother's voice said, smooth and fake as plastic fruit. We thought it was just a party. If we'd known it was a wedding, obviously we would have been there. They were trying to rewrite history. They wanted me to play along, to issue a statement saying it was all a big misunderstanding so they could salvage their reputation at the country club. But I wasn't playing. I called Grandpa Robert. He came over that Sunday, carrying a thick manila folder. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp. "I've been busy," he said, laying the folder on my kitchen island. "I had a hunch, Willow. Men like your father don't just make bad choices emotionally. They make them financially." He opened the folder. Inside were bank records and loan documents. My breath caught. There, in black and white, was a car loan for a $70,000 truck. Tucker's truck. The one he drove to practice. But the signature at the bottom wasn't Tucker's. And it wasn't my father's. It was mine. Or rather, a forgery of mine. "They used your credit," Grandpa said, his voice shaking with rage. "They knew you had good standing. They co-signed you without your knowledge. That wasn't the only thing." Grandpa pulled out a tablet. "I share a cloud account with your mother," he said. "She's never been good with technology. She backs up everything." He tapped the screen. It was a log of activity from 3 months ago, the date I'd sent the digital invitation. The log showed the email being opened on my mother's iPad at 4:12 in the afternoon. But my mother was at her bridge club then. I knew because she posts every time she goes. "Who was home?" "Tucker." The log showed the email was read, and then 2 minutes later permanently deleted. Then a text message was sent from my mother's phone to mine. "We'll be at the game." It wasn't negligence. It wasn't a mistake. My brother had seen the invite. He'd realized my wedding clashed with his championship, and he'd deleted it. He'd made the choice for them, ensuring the spotlight wouldn't be split. He'd sabotaged me to keep his audience. I looked at the papers. I looked at the digital trail. The sadness that had been lingering in the back of my throat evaporated. This wasn't a tragedy. It was a crime scene. 3 days later, the inevitable happened. Tucker lost his scholarship. The injury was bad, but the PR was worse. The university didn't want the baggage of a player being roasted on national news for sabotaging his sister. The scouts stopped calling. And without the promise of an NFL contract, the house of cards my parents had built began to collapse. They showed up at my conservatory on a Tuesday evening. I saw them through the glass walls, my mother, my father, and Tucker, hobbling on crutches. They looked smaller than I remembered. Desperate. I met them at the door. I didn't invite them in. "Willow, please," my mother started, her eyes red and swollen. "We're losing everything. The bank is calling about the truck. They're going to garnish your father's pension. We need you to help us refinance. We're family." Tucker wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at the ground, looking for the first time like a child who'd broken a window, not a star who owned the world. "Family," I repeated. The word tasted like ash. I reached behind me and picked up the stack of papers Grandpa and I had prepared. I handed them to my father. "This is a fraud affidavit," I said. "I've already filed it with the police and the bank. It states that my signature on Tucker's truck loan was forged. The debt isn't mine. It's yours." My father went pale. You filed a police report. On us. And this," I said, handing a second sheet to Tucker, "is the server log from Mom's iPad." Tucker flinched as if I'd thrown a stone at him. You didn't just miss my wedding, I said, my voice calm, factual, lethal. You stole it. You deleted the invite because you were terrified that for one single day, someone else might be the center of attention. My mother gasped, turning to look at Tucker. You knew. I watched them fracture. And in that moment I understood something profound. Sociologists call it the cost of borrowed glory. My parents didn't love Tucker. They loved the reflection of themselves they saw in his success. They'd hollowed themselves out, pouring all their identity into his potential fame. Now that he was broken, now that the glory was gone, they weren't just disappointed parents. They were bankrupt souls. They had no self-worth left because they'd invested it all in a volatile stock that had just crashed. I didn't curse his game, I said, stepping back and putting my hand on the door handle. He cursed this family the moment he decided I didn't exist. And you let him. Willow, wait, my mother screamed, lunging forward. Goodbye, I said. I closed the heavy glass door. I turned the lock. And then I pulled the blinds. The seasons changed, and so did the locks on my heart. I didn't hear from them after that day. The legal system took over. My parents were forced to sell their house to pay off the debts and legal fees for the fraud charges. They downsized to a 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. Tucker took a job at a car dealership, not as a manager but in sales. He wasn't the golden boy anymore. He was just a guy who used to play football. My landscape business boomed. The photos from the wedding had gone viral, not just for the drama but for the design. Clients wanted the Willow aesthetic. Resilient, wild, and unapologetically beautiful. I hired 2 new architects. I bought the land adjacent to the conservatory to expand. One evening in late autumn, I received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was my mother's. I stood by the fire pit in my garden, the cold air biting at my cheeks. I didn't open it. I didn't need to know if she was sorry or angry or begging. It didn't matter anymore. I tossed the unopened envelope into the flames. I watched the paper curl, the ink turning to black smoke that rose up into the stars. The revenge of self-made joy. That's what I call it. People think revenge is about destruction. They think it's about making the other person hurt as much as you did. But that's low-level thinking. True revenge is philosophical. It's the act of removing your happiness from their reach. It's building a life so complete, so vibrant, and so full of love that their absence becomes irrelevant. Their punishment isn't my anger. It's my indifference. It's the fact that they're starving for a seat at a table they burned down, while I'm feasting. The next morning, Cooper, Grandpa Robert, and I gathered in the center of the conservatory. We were planting a new oak tree, a symbol of roots that go deep and branches that shelter only those who offer shade in return. I patted the soil down around the trunk, my hands dirty and warm. Grandpa rested his hand on my shoulder. Cooper smiled at me from across the leaves. I looked at the camera, speaking to the thousands of people who'd followed this journey. If you've ever had to prune your own family tree to let your happiness grow, hit that like button and share your story. You're not alone in this garden.